And yeah, hey everyone, welcome to the Fundamental Escape podcast. I'm your host, Mark Fitzgerald, and I'm here with another installment of my Detox series. Today I'm joined by Teresa Pasquale, who is the author of the new book, Sacred Wounds, which is a path to healing from spiritual trauma, which sounds super deep and super interesting. Welcome, Teresa.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I look forward to talking about all things sacred wounds.
Yeah, I feel like we can just sort of dive in and sort of see where the conversation goes, you know?
Sure.
So I guess I like to, obviously with people I haven't met before, I do like to kind of put a bit of my story out there for context so you can sort of get a basic understanding of where I'm coming from, I suppose. I grew up in the church all my life, as I've said in many other places. I grew up in a bit of an evangelical bubble, if you will. All my friends were Christian, all the music I listened to was Christian, everything like that. I'm sure you've heard the story a million times. So yeah, I guess on that note, what's the sort of the thumbnail sketch of your sort of story in regards to the church?
Well, I grew up in a devout Catholic family and had some difficulty early on just with general hypocrisy and even at a young age, my late childhood, early teens, kind of seeing the way that people were acting or reacting to the world as different than what they were preaching or talking about. Coming from a Catholic tradition, I don't have some of the more extreme fundamentalism experiences.
Oh, you missed out.
I missed out big time. Yeah, that many of the people I've talked to and worked with, as a result of doing the work around sacred wounds have. So it's a slightly different experience. I did have, however, my parents sort of mistakenly sent me to this pretty fundamentalist evangelical summer camp because friends of ours were sending their children and they just didn't really have the awareness either of that kind of like level of scary devoutness, I could say. And so, they were just, the friends of the family just said, oh, it's adventure camp and they love to go every year. And in Sacred Wounds, I call it propaganda camp because there was all kinds of propaganda, and particularly these nighttime rallies with, the lead of the camp with a big megaphone saying a lot of things that I thought were not, they were not the God that I imagined, or it was not the Christianity I wanted to be a part of. And I had one particular night where he started talking about who goes to heaven and hell. And my camp counselors kept me up all night trying to convince me that I was wrong. And that if I was going to stick with all people that are good would end up in heaven, that I'm not a real Christian. And so I sort of made a determination based on that, if that's the criteria, then I'm out. And that was at about 12, I think. And then around 14, I kept going to church just because it was something the family did every week, but more and more adversarial about doing it. And somewhere around probably 14, 15, I stopped going altogether and then left the church in any way for about a decade or so and came back for me specifically through contemplative practice and the mystic tradition. So sort of a different lens of how my belief system was constructed.
Yeah, we can definitely dive into the whole mystical stuff maybe later. That sounds super interesting. Full disclaimer, you kind of you came out the gate pretty strong with some of those things you said in regards to the whole propaganda and hypocrisy and heaven and hell. And I was involved with street evangelism for about 5 years, and I completely burnt out after 5 years of doing that. I've talked about it in other places. I had a psychological breakdown essentially, and it was quite intense. I was actually hospitalized and things like that. So it was pretty full on. That's part of my story there. Just a little window into that. So obviously I can completely resonate with what you're saying. The whole and it's interesting. I mean, you did sort of dive straight in, and it makes me think. I think half the disconnect between people, with people internally within the church is this kind of, on the one hand, you've got this narrative that's telling you that you have to get your doctrine right, your theology right, and you have to get it all right and lined up, right? And then on the other hand, you've got these real human feelings of emotion, and we bleed, and we have, as you say in your book, trauma. That we have these real human issues, and it seems to me that when you're in that framework of the church, and again, I'm only speaking from my experience of evangelicalism, really, you're not really encouraged to dive into the real sort of side of life. It's very compartmentalized. Would you resonate with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's engaging the brain, it's engaging thought process in a very strict nature of thought process, very defined and narrow scope. But unfortunately for so many people, it doesn't allow them to really integrate their heart and their spirit into their belief system. Something I've found in recent years in doing the research for Sacred Wounds and also working with people since then and doing talks and whatnot is that part of the healing for people spiritually is actually teaching people to find intimate personal connection with whatever that is that they define. Maybe called God, it may not anymore because that may be a hurtful language system.
Yeah. Oh, I talked to Reba Riley. She educated us on the whole Godiverse word,
Right. Yeah, that's her the language she gave to a thing so it didn't have the stigma anymore.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It totally makes sense. And I was just thinking, I had this kind of last minute thought before we jumped on this call was, for me, I think one of the lifelines, as I mentioned, for me, I grew up, listening to basically all Christian music. One of my, favorite bands was the band Switchfoot, and I just had some, I just pulled up some of their lyrics that I thought were quite, quite timely and relevant for this sort of conversation. They have one of their tracks is called The Economy of Mercy. And there's just some lyrics here that basically it says, these carbon shells, these fragile dusty frames, house canvases of souls. We are bruised and broken masterpieces, but we did not paint ourselves. And I think I just sort of had this thought. I was like, man, I think for me growing up, like you talked about that kind of head, like intellect thing with the whole doctrine. And I think some of the music I was exposed to growing up was a real lifeline to, to sort of reaching my heart level, if that makes sense,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think creative process, can do that. And so music has the ability to be a little bit more intimate than just the straight teachings. But I know for a lot of people, it's hard to bridge in that healing process. It's a real learning of how to connect what I feel and what I believe and to have it be able to sit in heart and in spirit. And in some ways, deconstructing the mind part is only part one. A lot of people, as they're leaving a hurtful tradition, is still deconstructing from a head part. But there's this sort of reconstructing or reconnecting from a heart and a spirit place that I think is those are the other components of the healing process. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And it's really interesting. As I say, I mean, I could take this conversation in so many different directions, and I want this whole sort of detox series it's very experimental. As I say, I'm a very impulsive person, I have to admit, and I kind of just go, hey, this sounds like a good idea, let's do it. I really do want to reach out to people who feel like their story has been invalidated. And, over the last 6 months, I have had the amazing opportunity, like I mentioned, to talk to some of these amazing people who have written books. And obviously you've got your book as well, which I know that I definitely will read at some point in my life. It's half the trouble when you start interviewing authors for your podcast, because you have to read their books. It's
a lot of work.
It becomes a full-time job,
Right.
But I don't get paid for it just yet. But anyway, so I guess what I'm keen to do and open up is, I'd love to hear some of your story. If you, I don't know how much you're willing to share. Obviously, you read a whole book, so I'm sure you were pretty candid there. I'd like to do as much as I can to connect, because one of the things I think is one of the biggest issues is, owning our story, right? Owning where we are. And I think I've been through, a heck of a lot of trauma and pain in my life. And, obviously it's all relative. There's people that have been through much worse than me. Absolutely. But where do we even begin? Because I think, the human heart to me seems like a mystery even unto ourselves, right? We don't even seem to understand what's going on in our own sort of psyche most of the time. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, and I think trauma is such a dense word, and in some ways, it needs to be unpacked in and of itself for people to see that their pain may be authentic trauma. Oftentimes it is. I always say, people are very often wanting to compare their pain to other people's and minimize their own, like
like I just did.
Like you just did. Yes, no, exactly though. It's, but I'm sure it's not as bad as, and the truth is, from working in trauma for over a decade, I just advise people not to qualify it by other people's experience, because pain is so subjective that what is excruciating for me is 100% valid as the most excruciating thing that's happened to me. And it doesn't matter that it may not look, if I try to compare it to somebody else's pain, there's no way to scale that, because how I feel 100% of pain is going to be different than how somebody else feels 100% of pain.
Yeah, absolutely. You're giving me license to just like unload my stories on you. Let me tell you about my pain. No, I mean, the thing is, no, I totally agree with you. And I wonder why, like, as I just did essentially what you said there, is minimize my own kind of pain. And I wonder why we do that. Why do we, is it that we're scared to open this Pandora's box that's never going to like close again? What are your thoughts on that sort of thing?
I think it can be a mix of things. It can be a fear of validating that the pain is as big as it is, so if I feel it as big as it is, then that's scary. I think it's going to take me over. And then I think it's also just this natural sense, particularly, even more so, it's a sort of paradox. If you've experienced trauma, you've been hurt in such a way that you're less likely to validate yourself, period. So it's sort of a nature of trauma to minimize my own pain and suffering, because I've not yet been taught to value myself 100% as an authentically valuable human being. So, I worked with everything from, combat trauma to extreme childhood sexual abuse, and almost invariably people say, but I'm sure it's not as bad as someone else. And you might hear your story and go, oh my God, my story isn't as bad as that.
Yeah.
So just it's this human capacity to minimize our own suffering, and to not, that we are authentically worthy of love and goodness and wholeness, and that whatever it is that has destroyed parts of me in my life is just as valuable as anyone else's pain. Yeah,
absolutely. And there's a few thoughts I have. I saw on your Facebook you got to catch up with Rob Bell recently. And I'm hoping I'm in contact with his publishers at the moment, so I'm hoping to connect at some point. For me, he was a huge lifeline. After, as I've mentioned, back in 2008, I had a huge, psychological breakdown essentially. And, I was sort of in the recovery mode of that happening. A friend of mine who I actually interviewed him yesterday on my podcast, funny enough, he gave me a couple of Rob's books, and it was just a lifeline. It was like, oh my goodness, there's some space here for me to be in pain. And I really enjoyed his his Drops Like Stars tour, where he was talking, he basically had a few lines there where he said, pain has a way of making us more honest, and the other thing I liked was when he talked about that he says every good artist must realize that even the failed pieces are necessary, right? And I think that's really interesting to me, because I think a lot of what goes on after we go through these, traumatic experiences is the part where we try and figure it all out, and we try and, put it into boxes. And I think sometimes it just doesn't fit. And maybe that's going back to what we were saying earlier. Like, maybe that's why we don't want to look at it, because we're just like, this is just too big, right? This is just too painful to even open up.
Absolutely. And I think with religious and spiritual trauma, it's it's often layers of trauma, that there's so much to unpack that goes back to, I mean, the belief in God and whatever principles that you're taught as a child build the foundation of who you are. So to pull at that because that is the same thing that hurt you is essentially pulling away, even if it's an unhealthy foundation, it's pulling at the very core of everything I learned about the world. That's a lot to pull apart.
Oh, absolutely. I guess, I mean, a few sort of key pieces of my story, and maybe this is some free trauma therapy for me. But you are actually a qualified therapist, aren't you?
I am, yes.
Yeah. I hope you're not charging me for this.
Not at all.
So, I mean, it's quite funny actually. Well, not funny, as in haha funny, but interesting. I interviewed Kathy Escobar recently. I'm actually hoping to get her on this Detox series as well. I was on her blog this morning, actually, and there was a comment that someone posted about, I don't want to, I'm not going to name names or anything, so you can go on there, it's public, domain, but essentially they were kind of sharing some concerns, if you will, about the upbringing and the things their dad had taught them and, that were negative. And I was like, oh, okay. So I read through it and I was just like, I actually made a comment because I grew up without my dad completely. And I kind of was like, well, at least you had a dad kind of thing, I was like, fantastic. He may not have been perfect, but at least you had a dad that was present. So, growing up without a dad was a huge part of my story, obviously. And I think, and I did touch on the idea, the fact of, getting into sort of street evangelism. And part of that, I was just reflecting with my friend yesterday was, part of it was, I had this belief about heaven and hell, and I was trying to do my best to remedy that. But then at the same time, looking back, I was like, I just wanted to be important. I just wanted validation. I just wanted somebody to be proud of me, essentially, and say, well done, and good on you, and you're doing a good thing. And I think I still have that impulse sometimes. I'm still looking for validation. And so I think, and one thing, actually, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, because so growing up without my dad, I always felt like I never missed out on anything because it was just normal. I was like, that's my life. That's just reality. So I never really felt a gap. And I said this to he was actually a pastor of a church I was at the time. I said this to him. I said, I never really felt like I missed out on anything growing up without my dad. And he said something to me. It was like a single line that just broke me wide open. And he said, you have missed out on a lot. You just don't know what you've missed out on. And I was just like, oh dear. Like, wow. And it just kind of sent me on this kind of path of like realizing how messed up and bloody and bruised and broken I really, really was. And, in some ways still am, to be honest, so I guess I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts on that sort of thing.
Sure. And I think, the interesting thing, and I talk about this a bunch in the Sacred Wounds book, is there's different levels of parentage. So God becomes the parent over all, and then the physical parents become the embodiment of whatever that dogma we've been taught to believe that our Godfather, essentially, Godfather believes. And when that's unhealthy, it creates a dysfunctional relationship, I would say in some ways, regardless of whether you have a two-parent household or one person's absent, because there's this ultimate parent that everyone is purveying the information for that is saying things that are hurtful or may negate me or may not, as you said, make me just feel good that I'm valuable. And so in some ways that the relationship to unhealthy religion really is like an unhealthy parent-child relationship. It's just that people have been given the myth of this unhealthy parent that doesn't have to exist. Yeah. And I think just the same with human parents. We can look and say, well, not having one would be better or having one will be better. But when things hurt us, particularly through a faith system, it really is a family system of kind of hurt. It really is God the Father, purveying this information through all of these people in our community and our family systems. And so I would say it's all harmful parenting. It's based on misinformation. So I think we can look at our human relationships and see the places where things are missing and
Mm.
where we're hurt and where we want to change this story. Or I talk a lot
Yeah.
also about the narrative, change the narrative from what I've been given to what I want it to be or what it needs to be in my life. I think that happens no matter what kind of actual family system we have.
Yeah, and I've heard again, I mean, just bringing out Rob Bell quickly again, I know he talks about the idea of like changing the tapes sort of thing, which is kind of what you just said. And for me, again, like I've gone through these periods of my life where I've been drawn to different people. And I think, even in the likes of reading someone like him and other people like Brian McLaren, who I had the amazing chance to speak to when he was here in New Zealand, actually, it's kind of like more so in someone like Brian, I think, because I immediately saw a father's heart when I started reading his books, and I was really drawn to that. I was like, oh my goodness. So I think you can, this is what I want to kind of put out there and talk about as well, is that, yes, we go through these traumatic things, but we're not helpless victims, right? We're not powerless to heal and to go on this path. And I think it does take a huge amount of intention to go through these processes. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, and something like you're saying, that reading a text from Rob Bell or Brian McLaren offers you a chance to have a different reflection of faith, of God, and also of yourself, so our brain changes around trauma. We have traumatic experience and it changes the way we function. But I always say that the proof that it changes is also the proof that we can change it again, which means that we all have the capacity to transform and change at a biological, at a heart, at a spiritual level, those things that have broken us, and find ways to repair them, often in new communities and through new texts and something that's going to offer a new story.
Yeah. So I guess I'm just gonna be an open book here, because this is interesting to hear your feedback, I guess, and reflection. So another huge element of my story, as I say, growing up in this real Christian bubble and, trying to do the right thing and keep the rules and, please God and please people and, be happy all the time, because Christians aren't allowed to be sad, it creates a lot of pressure, and so I want to shorten the story as much as I can, because I don't want to drag it up. But basically, long story short, this is to do with kind of the whole thing of like heartbreak sort of thing, because I went through this huge trauma in regards to that. So there was a girl, not going to name names, that came along to the sort of environment that I was in, this church environment. Now she hadn't been exposed to the religion that I had. She was completely outside of it and coming into it sort of thing. And to me, that was like, wow, that was hugely refreshing. I was like, oh my goodness, you're not like everyone else around me. And that's amazing. So long story short, this kind of friendship, we ended up being friends, but, obviously only friends sort of thing. And it went on for sort of a number of years, and it was just ongoing, slow kind of self-torture, I suppose, in some ways, this trauma that just dragged on and on and on. And and a lot of it, you sort of look back and can make more sense of stuff like that, but you kind of like, it's this thing where you put this person on this level where they're the most amazing person ever, and you're just a piece of crap who's just lucky to be in their presence sort of thing. And it just becomes this real dehumanizing process that you kind of put yourself through. And to be quite frank about it, I'm not fully, healed from that, and I don't even know if I ever will be, because I think those things are so deep and they take a part of you that I'm still trying to figure this shit out, to be honest with you.
Aren't we all? It's a lifelong journey.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm keen to hear your story. I mean, I suppose, what are your thoughts? Like, I mean, just in regards to things like that, like heartbreak or pain or suffering, or, there's trauma that can happen to you in a moment, and then there seems to be trauma that can be sort of dragged out over many, many years. And I think that's the stuff that seems to be harder to identify, right?
Yeah, and in clinical terms, we would call those kind of traumas either ones that have been dragged out over years, which I would say pretty much all religious and spiritual trauma fit in that category, because it's usually through whatever it is, from when you're born through the duration, or when you joined a tradition through the duration. But in clinical terms, we call that complex trauma, because it is different than...
It's the word, complex, that's the right word.
It's complex trauma, because it's different than I was in a car accident, or even terrible traumas. I was sexually assaulted, or there's an incident that we can focus the pain and suffering around, and there may be ripple effects in the life of how it's impacted you. Like, I'm a sexual trauma survivor. I have 2 sexual traumas in my past. My first book was written about that. But it's a different kind of trauma than one that's sustained. So comparatively, religious trauma is usually closer linked to things like domestic violence, or even somebody being in extensive amount of combat over the period of a year or something, or, childhood sexual assault in environments that they're stuck in for 10, 15 years. Yeah. It's more along that complex trauma continuum, because sometimes also folded into it feeling unsafe and me not feeling okay about myself throughout this duration of my life, this period. There may also be, for some people, not all, but there might be physical or emotional or sexual abuse or other, like bullying or cruelty or whatever it is. You layer them in over time, and it is more, it's not impossible to untangle, let's say, but it does definitely, it's more of a process, because there's just going to be a more complex, almost like a web, a more complex system of ripples of how each and every piece of that journey, had hurt in it.
I wonder if, like you sort of talked about the term, religious trauma. I wonder for the listeners if you're able to sort of unpack what, like, if they could, just some ideas about that they can resonate with, perhaps.
Sure. And again, the terminology is not really fully created to be like a clinical definition yet. I hope that it will be in the near future. Right now it would fit under just a subtype of trauma, and if people had PTSD, a subtype of PTSD. Part of what I hope to do, not just with the book, but the speaking that I'm doing and expanding that into trainings, is to actually inform people, both in faith settings and in mental health settings, what it is and how to begin to address it, because I think it is different than other kinds of trauma. And the way that I would define it, and some people call it religious trauma, some people call it spiritual trauma. Sacred wounds is my sort of metaphor for that idea. But really what it is being in a system of belief, and in a community construct in which whatever is being told to you about yourself or the world is harmful, or can be combined with acts of harm or of utilizing positions of power within those systems to take those beliefs that might be hurtful and even do hurtful acts like sexual assault, like physical assault, like, just real emotional abuse, say, of either children or in a marital system, or even just in some kind of structural work environment within a faith construct. But it's really, from the basis, it begins with a belief system that's harmful, that negates people rather than builds them up. And then it can expand from that to a place of power from those doctrines, creating people that will then purvey other, crimes of or in control, which might be sexual, physical, emotional, harassment, all of those other things.
Yeah, well, not to get too sort of theological for too long, because I think people will lose interest, because I lose interest after a while. But, it's that sort of idea that we shape our gods and then our gods shape us. And it seems, if you want to take that basic sort of belief, like we talked earlier, the whole heaven-hell paradigm, when you're taught this idea that if you don't get your belief right, and if you don't line up, or in regards to orthodoxy, then when you die, essentially it's going to be very, very bad for you, to put it lightly. That belief system has to have a psychological impact on us, and it seems to be something that we never talk about in the church. I talked with my friend Matt Martin, actually it's episode 3 of this series, about he was sort of reflecting on this idea that the church is sort of late to the game with regard to sort of this theology around suffering. And I said, isn't it ironic that the core of Christianity is the center of Christianity is essentially the cross, and yet suffering seems to be the one thing we struggle to deal with the most?
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, hurtful and harmful theology often stays very superficial in my context in terms of what it asks of people in here and now, and what it, like you said, threatens of people of the hereafter. I call it like the Willy Wonka golden ticket syndrome. It's like It's like, well, only so many people get the golden ticket, but if you do, pretty much you don't have to worry about anything else for the rest of your life. If
Yeah.
you don't have a golden ticket, though, we're real sorry, but you're going to burn in the fire of hell for
Yeah.
all eternity. Love you, but that's going to happen.
Although it is, if with the Willy Wonka analogy, it's still problematic if you get a golden ticket because the kids went through some different traumas themselves in the adventure.
They did,
Um,
yeah. That's kind of
they could,
that's kind of that's the irony of it. You know what I mean? Well, people have an expectation of this golden ticket, and
yeah,
it's a false in the sense of what it offers us in terms of what we're supposed to do and be in the here and now. Like you even said earlier, but on the theology lens of it really being right thought, that
yeah,
rules, and that people's actions that emanate out of that are just in the pursuit of maintaining this idealized right thought, and in the process, the actions of actually taking care of the other, the broken, the suffering, all of those things that Jesus actually told us to do get washed away for doctrine that only vaguely emanates from his teachings.
yeah. Well, this is one of the things I think is the biggest issue I have seen in the church growing up is, as you say, when to carry on your analogy, because I think it's funny in a way, when you've got the golden ticket and you're in the factory, when you feel like you're on the winning team, you don't have much impulse to question the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have this tribalistic I'm in and they're out sort of theology, you're not motivated at all to challenge that idea, and nobody seems to challenge it,
right,
at all.
right.
Why
And
would you?
yeah, exactly. Well, that, like you said, there's a comfort. There's a unhealthy comfortability that shows up. It's a very surface layer spirituality that kind of holds. It goes to the basis of our most primal nature, which is belonging, and it takes unhealthy things and pulls us into unhealthy systems of belonging. But what we do want as people more than anything, which is also why it's hard for people when they leave unhealthy religious systems, is we genuinely do want community and we do want belonging. But we're tethered when people are stuck in systems that are unhealthy of belief. They are tethered to this unhealthy sense of self and sense of others to stay in the belonging system, which is always why it's hard for anybody to say anything against, because particularly in religion, more than almost anything besides, say, an actual full-on cult, which some of them border, depending on some of the stories I have are cults and some are traditions that we could say mimic some cult-like behavior. It's very isolative, it's very interior, it's very exclusive, but everything that you have in your life is within the system, so if you leave the system, you're leaving oftentimes family, your friends for your whole life, your entire community, maybe even your job. It creates its own subsystem, and so it becomes much harder to leave even when people begin to think this doesn't sound right or it doesn't feel right or I don't like what people are doing. It's a really hard thing to untether yourself from, which, like you said, is why so many people end up feeling like they're falling apart or have nervous breakdown when they leave, because there's nothing yet. There's no new system. There's no new community, and there's no new belief that's able to hold you up. You're just floating in thin air for a while.
Well, my story is a little bit different in the sense, and I reflected on this yesterday. I didn't consciously leave the church. I didn't say, "Oh, this is toxic. I'm out of here." As I said, for me, it just, after going through the pain and the trauma that I went through, it just stopped. The whole system just stopped making sense. Essentially, it wasn't this, "Oh, I'm angry, I'm leaving." I was just like, this just doesn't even. It's like the whole the experiences that I've had to a point, and I think it's still a process, but it sort of woke me up. I was like, "Oh, I'm alive. I'm a human being. I'm allowed to have feelings. I'm allowed to hurt and be in pain, and you sort of validate your own humanity." Because I think that's one of the things, and I'd love it if you have any thoughts on this, because I think it's huge, is that, and I sort of mentioned this, I think, in my discussion with Kathy Escobar, was when you become a Christian, it's almost like you become less human, not more human, right? It's like you fall into this category where, again, it's this very in-out paradigm, and it's, I'm a Christian, so I'm supposed to be happy all the time, and I'm not allowed to feel pain, and the pressure that puts people under is just incredible. you know, and it's no wonder. And I think, you know, books like yours and say the likes of Kathy or Reba, I think is so necessary in this time. There's such a need for this kind of, I guess, if you want to get theological, this sort of theology around suffering and how to engage with it, because man alive, the church seems to have dropped the ball incredibly when it comes to pain and suffering.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as I found unhealthy systems, I found ones that are doing it better. You know what I mean? So I would say there is some of church that is engaging suffering and that is acknowledging some of its woundedness. Now, of course, systems are always going to inherently have elements of self-protection. So even the best ones are going to do it in a way that still feels safe for them. Yeah. But there's a lot of church that most certainly, like you said, it's the happy face, you know? It's like, and also that's what leads to the downfalls of leaders of some of those organizations. You know, you find out that somebody was watching, you know, was compulsively watching porn, or was, you know, having sex in bathrooms, or was embezzling all of this money, is also because it is a very surface layer way of being. It's just look right and talk right and have this right idea of thought that doesn't require anything of us in terms of evolving as people below the surface. And it also doesn't allow for imperfection. And so everybody is always going to fall short eventually.
Isn't this, you know, I wonder the impulses, you know, I mean, you mentioned some pretty, you know, interesting behavior examples there of things, and you know, we all have our stories, and you know, again, I'm not gonna air all my dirty laundry in one podcast, but you know, I'm certainly not proud of all the decisions that I've made in my lifetime. You know, I went through a sort of a phase of diving into the whole, you know, world of alcohol and sort of drowning my pain there, and you know, that works for a while, I suppose. But I sort of wonder, like, the impulse to do some of these things, and again, that, you know, you go into the church world and it's like, oh, well, you do this because you're a bad person. It's original sin, right? You're just a bad person. But I think it's a desire for connection. I think every human being is, you know, wired for connection. And I think I actually did a little bit of a word study on even the word religion, which is tied to the word like as in ligament, like religa, to reconnect, you know. It's this sort of idea to find connection, and I think, you know, we need to stop putting out these messages to say you're just a bad person and that's why you do this, to going, maybe there's something deeper going on, you know. Right. Maybe there's something behind the thing, as Rob Bell would say.
Well, and luckily, you know, I've been trained therapeutically as well as working in the spiritual realm, and really it's like the first place that that I go to. So I see somebody who is drinking excessively or is compulsively watching porn or whatever it is. Everybody that shows up in my office, no matter what they've done, are equal, and I don't hold judgment against. You know, that's part of the nature of my training. And unfortunately, we have some of the opposite of that in church systems, when you would think that level of acceptance of human beings would be more, and that we need to do better than it's just sin, right? Because it is the thing that's under the thing. It is that all of those expressions of our woundedness in the world are, again, go back to some inability to be able to find connection to self and to others, and not being connected is painful. And so we're going to do just about anything we can to not feel the pain of disconnection. And if nobody, particularly in the church of all places, is sitting there and helping us find a way to heal it, just telling us it's sin and pray it away is not a methodology for healing disconnection. It's a way for annexing people further and disconnecting them further.
Yeah. Well, isn't there something interesting happening when it's, you know, in the whole world of the church? Because essentially, I mean, the church is the people. There is no separation. I mean, it's you know, it's almost like the oppressed and the oppressor are the same. That seems to be the complicated part of it. You know, I mean, my hands certainly aren't clean in regards to things I've told other people and tried to put on them. And, you know, I'm not going to sit here and just play victim and go, oh, poor me, I went through this church system and it did this to me. And because that's just not the truth. You know, that's just not the truth. There's more going on than that. And, you know, again, I think it's some of the impulses and the drives to do what we do, you know, I would say do at times come from good places. I think some of the most terrible things I've been told, you know, came from people with good hearts. You know, that's the hard part about it.
It is. It is. I mean, the girls, I speak about in Sacred Wounds, just finding a place over time for forgiveness for the girls that, the camp counselors that were bullying me, all night long to try to believe their theology. They were children too.
Mm,
They were a few
mm,
years older than me.
yeah,
Did what they did because they had been taught their whole life that if they didn't do this, that I was going to
yeah.
hell. They were
Yeah,
desperate.
absolutely. And look, I mean, given my story as someone who was an ex-street evangelist, I think I can resonate with where they're coming from completely because, for me, in my time of doing that, it had absolutely nothing to do with bullying people or what, at least consciously, that's not what I was wanting to do. It was just this, oh my goodness, I believe this idea and I need to warn people. I need to tell them. It was a compassionate sort of motivation. So,
Mhm.
that seems to be the tricky part of it because it's hard to just turn these people into villains and go, oh, they're all evil. And I know that's not what you're doing, obviously.
Right,
um
right, right.
so
Well,
yeah.
and I think I've a number of the questions that I've gotten, and the book really is for everybody, wherever you are, wherever you're coming from, whatever your experience is. But I've gotten a lot of questions as I'm doing talks about what is the best way to heal, address, or to offer things for those that have been the perpetrators in those situations.
Mm,
Just harmful harmful and painful theology that other people suffered at the hands of. And inevitably, like you're talking about, so many people now that are in a sort of more progressive faith context and trying to do things differently is because they were doing it a certain way at one time, that they just had this illuminated moment that this is not the way that I'm going to best serve
yeah.
God. But it doesn't, but many people still carry with them the guilt of what they did before they knew, before they
Yeah.
had
Oh,
this.
absolutely.
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
so I think that's a huge part of it as well. We don't just say, oh, we'll forget that and move on. There is real healing that has to be done for
Mm,
both. And oftentimes people are both, right? You're the person that was hurt by the system. That's why I would say the system more than you know what I mean? It's like a systemic hurt. The people
mm,
that are hurt by the system. And then you can also be people that were utilized in that process to hurt others, none of which was intentional. And we have to find part of the healing process, I think, is both. It's there's just beautiful representation in the 12 steps. I reflect on that. I have a chapter on the 12 steps and the sort of 12 steps for this particular healing process. But part of that process is we're examining the things we've done, we're making amends where we can, and then we're allowing ourselves to let go.
yeah.
Both of us hurt us and how we've hurt others, and finding a way to make good out of it. How do I make good out of all of this stuff?
Right. And I think that comes back to, the whole idea of like owning our story, right? Like saying, again, that whole idea I was sort of saying that being the oppressed and the oppressor at different times. And I think it's just as important to own the reality of both. And I think what some people can do, and especially, I mean, this is another tangent we won't go down, but, we do tend to live in a world now that seems to be this sort of victim culture where people are, putting themselves into this victim status, and I'm this and I'm that and I'm oppressed because of X, Y, Z. And I mean, I'm not trying to take away from that because there are, these things are real, obviously, but I think we sometimes tell ourselves, as I like to say, Peter Rollins likes to say, I have a vested interest in telling myself a good story about myself because I have to live with myself,
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's, vulnerability versus over victimization. We can
Yeah.
get stuck in the role of being a victim, but it's important to acknowledge that we have been vulnerable and we've been hurt in those places. It's also important when people, and I always say as people are ready,
Yeah.
because truth is that there are different archetypes of the way that we are in certain places in our healing journey. And at certain moments, people have to sit in victim for a while because if they've been told that nothing bad happened to them
Mm,
for most of their life, and they've just realized that it has, I always say wherever people are is okay for right now. So if a person is feeling victimhood for the first time, and it's something that they're acknowledging really happened to them, then that's also an important part of their journey. It just may not be hopefully it's not the last part of the journey.
yeah, yeah. It's not the final word. Yeah,
Right, right.
yeah. I mean, Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I could, I guess we could take this conversation in so many different directions. There's sort of part of me that, I'd love to hear, just for the sake of interest, I suppose these, like there's always dramatic stories I'm sure you can sort of unpack and tell. But in some ways I don't want to do that because as I was saying with this sort of detox series, I want it to be grounded in everyday humanity. I don't, as much as it's interesting to hear some of these phenomenal stories of pain and trauma for other people, I want people to listen to this and go, yeah, I'm just an everyday kind of person. I haven't been through anything hugely dramatic necessarily. But for them to self-reflect and to kind of go, where am I hurting? What am I invalidating that may be kind of hurting me without sort of realizing it? You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there's a number in Sacred Wounds, there's a number of stories from different people on different parts of the journey. So I think there's places where story is important and it's good to listen. But same way with vulnerability versus over victimization is we also don't want to get stuck in the old story, that we really the only one of my teachers and really expert in traumatology, Bessel van der Kolk, said as he was sort of beginning to see a new way of doing therapy that had less to do with this historical lay on the couch and tell the story thing. I said, I realize more and more as I've done this profession that we think the story is necessary because we feel like we need to hear it so that we can help the client fix whatever it needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
And truth is that we don't. And that doesn't mean that the story isn't valuable and that storytelling isn't a greatly healing experience, but it means that it's not always the first thing people do, and it's not always essential to tell the story to be able to start to heal what is broken. The story has its place, and people hearing and resonating with other people's stories, I think, can be powerful, but we also don't want to leave ourselves in a place where we're just ruminating over that narrative, because then we're just entrenching it. We give it too much power if we sit in it too long. And part of it has to be about the revisioning forward of who do I want to be? How do I want to feel about myself? And what do I want to do to make that happen in my life?
Yeah. Well, this is something, and again, I'm sort of reminiscing, I guess, back to my, childhood growing up in the church and things like that, and you hear, and no doubt you've probably come across it many times, but you hear these obviously in the church you have your testimony that you'd get up and share, and this is how I came to know Jesus. And if you've been in the situation that I have where it's like, your whole testimony is I grew up in the church all my life and I've always been a Christian, basically, and it's like it's this boring and ordinary thing, and it's like, no, it's not boring and ordinary. Like, this is one of the things I want to put out there, is that your story is not boring and ordinary. It's your story, and it's important because it's you and it's part of who you are. And again, this whole idea of even the broken pieces are necessary and everything belongs, and it is. And I think it is too easy to, and you're absolutely right. Like, there's huge value in hearing these stories from other people and reflecting on the trauma that others have been through and going, oh my goodness, wow, that's, horrible, or that's huge, or whatever it is. But to sort of look at yourself and go, well, what I've been through isn't that big of a deal, and blah, blah, blah. That seems very... very problematic to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, and again, there are these good premises, right? The idea of testimony in theory, although I think that word is highly triggering for many people who come out of certain fundamentalism. Just even the word testimony, articulate something that can oftentimes make people go, ugh, because they remember those experiences of either for whatever reason, maybe just because it's part of the language of the thing that hurt them. Maybe it's because of the way that people presented themselves. I think it's the way that it's problematic. Also is that the narrative is over. You know what I mean? Like you just said, I grew up as a Christian. I'm living. That's my whole.
And now
story.
I'm just waiting to die and go to heaven.
Right, exactly. It's as if there's some kind of finite end. Also, I talk some in Sacred Wounds about sort of different trigger words. Every kind of trauma has things that trigger them, and especially if a culture is part of your trauma, a lot of language, like words like believer, words like testimony. Yeah. Words like saved, when were you saved? I remember the first time I heard somebody ask that, and I was like, I don't understand the question. I was raised Catholic. Like, we don't create timelines for that stuff. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I was like, I don't know what that means. So, like, the date when it happened. And I was like, I'm not sure.
I don't have
keep
that.
happening until I die. Like,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I should have transformative spiritual experiences
No,
until I die.
you
And if
brought
I'm
up a
not, then
yeah.
I'm not growing.
You brought up a word there a number of times, which was the word trigger or triggering.
Mm.
I have to be honest. The word trigger and triggering are kind of triggering for me.
Mm.
It's something that's quite interesting to me, and I would, joking aside, I guess it would be interesting to unpack a little bit because, well, this could turn into an interesting topic, but some of the conversations I've started having in regards to my podcast have been taken an interesting turn. I sort of jokingly said actually a while ago, if you got all the people in a room that I've interviewed over the last 6 months, it would be a very interesting interaction because they certainly don't see eye to eye by any stretch of the imagination. And I sort of wonder, obviously in today's world, things like trigger warnings and stuff seem to be more prevalent. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, because I think, the way you used it seemed okay to me. It didn't seem to trigger me too much. But it seems that there is a little bit of overkill on the idea of triggering and saying things are triggering. I don't know if you have any pushback on that at all.
Yeah, I'm a therapist, so I appreciate people being more cautious than less cautious. If that makes sense from the
Yeah.
healing dimension, you almost can't go too far. It's like rather put a precaution on something than have somebody in an unsafe space.
Yeah.
That said, I think it's important to articulate, so in Sacred Wounds, I do talk about some of the more common things that can trigger people, but that's really more as a reference point so that for people reading it who may have had, trauma in a religious context and go, oh, that's why that word might make me feel this way. Or,
Yeah, I wonder, sorry, not to interrupt. I just wonder if there's a better word than trigger, to be honest, because to me, this is just what it connotates to me. When someone says, oh, that word is triggering or that idea is triggering, that immediately says to me, that to me comes across like a barrier. It's like going, oh, that triggers me. Please don't go there or please don't say it. And I'm just like, my impulse is going, no, let's dive in. Let's talk about it and see what's there and why that is doing that to you. You know what I mean? That's kind of where, that's just me.
Sure.
That's sort of, I don't know. It just seems to have a bad connotation.
For me, triggering is a language that comes from psychotherapy and mental health.
Yeah.
And again, because of my field of practice and just sort of, for me, priority is people's safety. Your field is inquisition. You know what I mean? And we're going to be talking about things. I want to know about that thing. I want to know what that thing is. Let's talk about that. Which I understand the inclination, but my field of practice is just different, So when something triggers somebody, I do want to, in a safe way, help them to figure out what that is. But I also want to make sure that I'm keeping the space safe for them. I would imagine that the place and the ways in which you're interacting with people is going to be different. I'm going to be
talking about safe spaces. Oh my goodness. Oh man, this could evolve this conversation. Well, no, to be honest, look, I want to be as diplomatic as I can. But I do find some of this language a little bit troubling, to say the least. I do understand it, don't get me wrong. And to put some context on it, as I say, I am someone who's diagnosed as bipolar, so I'm someone who experiences mental health issues. So I'm not just an outside critic going, oh, that's too, and I've never had that language kind of used with me in regards to healing and things. I've never really, I don't know whether it's a different time that we're living in now. I don't know. I don't know where that comes from. I've never really had that be a part of my kind of road to recovery is that sort of language. And I guess it's a little bit foreign, if I can be honest.
Sure. Yeah, and it's specific to PTSD. So it's specific to trauma and PTSD.
Yeah.
So if you're someone like me that's worked for 10 years with trauma and PTSD, that's going to be just a primary part of the language of the system of healing.
But I'm not sure, again, if you're familiar, and I will just dive in here because it might make for some interesting conversation. You've got a lot of, in some of my discussions I've had a different, you've got there is that term they throw around they call people like social justice warriors, these people that are basically trying to say that everything is triggering and everything is racist and sexist and homophobic and oh my goodness, and everyone's offended. And I don't know if you're exposed to that reality, or it seems to be something that's happening on college campuses, and they do have this term safe space where basically people go to a room with Play-Doh and videos of puppy dogs, and like it's like, oh my goodness, what is happening? Like, it seems a little bit over the top sometimes, if I can be honest.
Sure. I mean, I don't know about puppy dogs, rooms with puppy dogs.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you're probably completely unaware of that reality. Yeah, I could send you some links.
Yes, recently I've never heard of that as a thing to do on college campuses. I would say I do, my work does overlap a lot with social justice, and so I do know, depending on what people's areas of passion is, there's sensitivities around certain things that might not make sense to people who don't experience those things. So issues of racial inequity are going to be more obvious to somebody who's actually been a victim of that.
Of course, absolutely. And I just want to make a point here to your credit. I mean, to me in this conversation, you seem like a very down-to-earth, grounded, reasonable person, and it seems clear that, with some of these examples I've given, that you're not quite aware of some of the things I'm referencing, which is fine. Just a fair warning, trigger warning, I don't know. Some of these realities are getting merged with the language you're using, and I think it probably is important that you are aware of it, because again, this is sort of what's happening, and again, there's something about it. I think there's a practical conversation to be had about it, and I'm trying to have this conversation with different people and get different perspectives. But again, I think it comes back to because we have this innate understanding of pain and suffering that sometimes we don't want to confront. It seems like people put up a front and a cover. And, and I've heard it said, like I heard this said by someone who was actually a sort of a therapist themselves, was the idea of anger, for example, anger being a cover-up emotion. Like anger is like a wall I throw up because there's something I'm hiding behind. It's something to hide behind in a sense, and so we seem to throw up these other grievances that don't seem so real and worth talking about, in my opinion, but maybe I'm just sort of wondering if there's something going on behind it that we're not prepared to talk about.
Well, I think it depends on what it is. So I've done a lot of work in social justice around racial inequity and gender inequity and sexuality inequity, and a lot of the hurt, the genuine trauma, hurt, and woundedness of people who've experienced that kind of pain and suffering in their lives. And so I would say that depends on what you're talking about,
as a practical example, I guess, I mean, some of the definitions of, and it's a tough word, and I know I'm a male talking about these issues, but some of the definitions, for example, of sexual assault have been so broadened that to me, and I've talked about this in some of my other episodes, it seems to be hurting actual victims, because people seem to want to broaden the definitions of some things so widely that a girl being sort of whistled at on the street, for example, is assault on the same level as someone who was actually physically violated in a dark alley, walking home, sort of thing.
Well, I would say at least in the States that's not true. Those would be two different kinds of crimes. One would be sexual harassment. It would depend on the severity of it. Also work extensively with sexual trauma and even in the judicial system working with victims advocates and that kind of thing. So there's a distinct difference in language and legal.
In the law, absolutely. When you're talking of the law, I'm totally on board with you, but I'm saying in the minds of the general public, these definitions seems to be changing. Not sure if you're...
I think, again, it depends on who you're talking to and what the context is, I could say that there's a connection between the escalation from someone that might whistle on someone on the street and harass them and continue to walk behind them or something. There's a correlation to people that do certain behaviors to the greater propensity for them to potentially be perpetrators.
It's, I think that was an interesting little sidetrack there. I think we could go on, but again, we're maybe talking about things that neither of us fully understand. How do we get this back on track? I suppose. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the reasons, again, like I say, my sort of conversation in the last 6 months on these podcasts have changed direction drastically. And, I definitely am on a process myself and journey with these ideas. And, part of me, to be honest, when I talk to the likes of Reba or Kathy, and I'm like, if they listen to some of my other episodes, they might not want to talk to me again. I just don't know. But again, I just want to make it clear, like, I'm still figuring stuff out, and I talk out loud. I like to think out loud, and, kind of, it's not that I've come to any definitive position on these ideas. I just think they're worth talking about, to be quite honest,
Absolutely. And I think there's room in this whole universe of dialogue for every part of the spectrum to have voice to talk about where they are and what their sort of construct is today.
Yeah, well, this is the balance. And I think this will help bring the conversation back to maybe a logical close, because we probably do need to wind down. But again, this kind of victim and oppressor sort of paradigm seems to be an issue because, it's sort of like, if we go too far one way or the other, it's like we're hurting one person at the cost of someone else. To say to someone, oh, your pain doesn't matter, obviously that's a terrible thing to say. But to say to someone else, oh, you can't talk about X, Y, Z because you might be hurting this person over here. It seems to be it's murky waters, to say the least.
It is, yeah, and it's delicate. It's delicate, and it can become explosive very quickly. And we're in a place and an age in which, from whether it be podcasts or Facebook groups or just your own Facebook page or your Twitter or whatever, everybody can say everything that they feel in this moment, and so that also can, there's a tendency for it to stir up.
I will be heard. I think this is probably a good place to wind down. Maybe you can just reflect on my thought here, but I think this is where the impulse comes from. And I talked about this actually yesterday as well with a friend. The appeal of something like Facebook and social media, where it's this deep human cry that says, "Don't ignore me." Don't ignore me. I need to be heard. I have a voice. I need to be heard. And I think sometimes, admittedly, I've probably done it where I'm the thing I'm complaining or crying or hurting about or saying I'm hurting about is not really the thing, Again, going back to that thing, it's probably the thing behind the thing. And I think that's a place I'd like to sort of explore and things like that. So, yeah, if you have any thoughts on that, just fire away, and then I guess we'll just leave it there for today.
Sure. I mean, I think it's sensitive space, right? I think that all of us have made, the error in personal judgment of saying the first thing we thought on either Facebook or Twitter, at least one time where it was like, oh, I should have waited 5 minutes,
Don't click send.
A day. So I started calling it one-click theology, this idea that it's just like, within one click, I can create a statement of meaning and purpose when in historic times, it would have taken a whole lot of effort for anybody to ever get my words to reach them. And by the time they would have been shaped differently. So yeah. I think for all of us, there needs to be an increased level of both patience and graciousness. And then also for ourselves, like that sort of pause, is this a thing that should be said? Do I need to wait until I can say it with a clearer mind? Do I need to say it at all? I think
why do we want to say the things we say? Like going to that question as well.
Right. And I think we could avoid more of that hurt in the crossfire of being heard. I think the value of all of this social media is what you just said, that everybody's been crying to be heard, and particularly around spiritual and religious trauma. People may be the only person in their town or in their community that are in the place that they're in, and they feel so alone. And so it's actually been a powerful tool for empowerment, for people being able to potentially leave unhealthy settings. So there's so much benefit to it. The harsh part is, when we say the things too fast, or somebody is reacting emotionally to some other thing in themselves, we can't control that, all those mechanisms.
If I had to read a list of my previous Facebook posts over the years, I would probably be terrified.
Right. Yeah, we just have to keep going forward, using the tools as they're accessible, and just be more intentional, more intentional and cautious with ourselves.
Yeah. I suppose just to, to push back a little bit on that. I mean, again, what I don't want to do, and I don't think this is necessarily what you're saying at all, but what I don't want to do is create, again, going back to that victim oppressive world where it's like, painting a world where this person's saying something I don't like, therefore they're the oppressor. It's like, well, no, they're a human being as well, and they have issues as well that they're, working through and trying to figure out. And that's the thing. That's the, Just to close, I think, and maybe you can close here, but, I like the way that sort of Reba Riley puts it with the whole imagery of like a divine disco ball, where it's like, we're all reflections of the divine, and that person's on the other side of the ball, and I don't have to deal with them, and I don't have to talk to them, and there's these magical buttons online called block, everybody has the freedom to say no and to not listen to things they don't want to listen to and things like that. So, but thank you so much for your time, Teresa. It's been amazing.
Absolutely. This has been a very enjoyable, interesting conversation. We got to hit a lot of points.
It's been a roller coaster.
Yeah.
No, thank you. That's awesome. I'll just stop there.